Hello, everyone. It's Frances Widdowson here. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. Today, I have invited on Glenn Blackett. And Glenn and I know each other relatively well. I can't say too much about our interaction because it's a lawyer-client matter. So we're going to stay away from some things which are quite interesting because of the legalities involved. But Glenn is a Calgary-based civil rights lawyer who is working with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. This is a network, and we have been interacting with one another for, I guess, a year or two about various legal problems that exist in Canada. Anyway, welcome to the Rational Space Disputations.
Thank you very much for having me.
And for people who have not seen the disputations before, the format generally is for me to ask the guest questions for about an hour. And then after an hour, we turn the screens so that the guests can ask me questions just to make sure that there's fairness that is prevailing. And as well, sometimes you leave things out and it's not apparent when you're asking questions. So it's a way to have a more fulsome discussion. Anyway, Glenn, before we get into some of these issues, especially to do with the legal system and what's called wokeism, perhaps you can just tell people a little bit about what makes you tick and what you've been up to over the last while.
Okay, I'd say like what makes me tick is I'm a pretty unusual lawyer in that I'm a lot more concerned about civil liberties than most lawyers seem to be. I think I came by it as a result of my undergrad. I took a degree in political science, minor in economics, and that was at the University of Calgary under what was at the time called the Calgary School, or even the Calgary Mafia, which was Ted Morton, Tom Flanagan, that sort of circle of academics that were classical liberals. So that was my background. And then I got into law and I spent about 20 years just doing, standard corporate commercial stuff. I was a litigator, but over the last 5 years, maybe more than that, I've started to become increasingly alarmed about wokeism. I thought, geez, wouldn't it be great if I could find some law firm that was like an anti-woke law firm, basically a law firm that was fighting against this stuff. And I found the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms network of lawyers. Went and met with John, and to my great delight, in August of 2022, he invited me over to their little network, and in November 1st, I started working there, and I've been working there for a year. So that's my basic background.
All right, yeah, and I think that's how we met, is through your interaction with the Justice Center. And the Justice Center, which we can't really talk about very much, is taking forward a case against the University of Lethbridge for violating freedom of expression rights. But we're going to stay away from that.
Okay.
And violate certain things that we're not aware of. Just to be sure, just to be safe that we're not doing things that we shouldn't be doing. So when you contacted me over a year ago, you were at the time, I believe, involved in some kind of attempts to hold the Alberta legal system to account for, I believe it was called the PAF. Is that right? Correct? Yep. Maybe you could just tell our audience a little bit about what that was all about, or still is ongoing, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, for sure. So in basically, I'll back up 100 years first. 100 years ago, the Law Society of Alberta was formed, and the Law Society is a self-governing professional regulator. So they're basically run by a bunch of benchers. The benchers are elected by lawyers. Those benchers decide how to regulate the profession. There's a president and a bunch of administration and stuff that work in the office. For the first century of their existence, they carried along just fine. And so far as I know, we had a number of eminent and well-qualified lawyers in Alberta that seemed to be doing just fine. Then in 2019, they decided, well, no, we better get into continuing professional development. They decided that they needed to be more proactive in continuing professional development. And that's a phrase that every professional knows, and probably others do too, which basically means you have to do education on an ongoing basis even after you're out of school. And I think it's important for lawyers to do, but I think it's kind of a natural part of the job. Like every time a lawyer almost every time a lawyer takes on a new file, there will be some new aspect to it that you haven't quite looked at before. And so you'll do research or read textbooks or do whatever. So education is part of what you do all the time. But there's certainly some kind of education like trust safety and stuff like that you wouldn't, come across in your practice. So you should be doing that sort of stuff. Anyway, continuing professional development is something that lawyers have always done, but it wasn't for the first century of the Law Society's history, something that the Law Society itself was involved in.
Mm.
And then in, actually it was about 2008, they got somewhat involved, hardly involved. And then in 2019, they got really involved. And in 2020, they basically suspended the light sort of continuing professional development obligations they had imposed on lawyers, and decided that they were going to force lawyers as their only continuing professional development obligation for the period 2020 to 2023, to take this thing called the path. And the path was called cultural competency training. And as I understand it, the idea was, or the premise of the education was that lawyers needed to be culturally competent when dealing with Indigenous peoples, so that they didn't re-traumatize Indigenous peoples, and so that they helped, reconciliation. And reconciliation is a term that means just about anything these days. So how, we could get into what that reconciliation looked like. But anyway, so lawyers had to do this thing called the path, and that was this cultural competency training. And it was basically like a, I don't know, 5-hour course or something like that, where you went online and watched a bunch of videos and then did a bunch of quizzes and got the correct answer on all your quizzes. Yep. And if you didn't do that, you were automatically suspended. And in November, I think it was, of 2022, they duly suspended about 50 lawyers in Alberta who hadn't done it. So I got in touch with you because one of the things I noticed on my own going through the path was that it wasn't very rigorous history. It was vigorous history, but not very rigorous history. And so we were talking about the sort of both, I think, the history of the thing, the veracity of the history in the thing, and then also I think more importantly the woke elements inside of it. And in early days, I wrote an article that was released in full in the Dorchester Review, and then it was also kind of in short form in the Epoch Times and the Western Standard that critiqued that path. And my observation was, isn't it funny that we're here, reconciling and learning about Indigenous perspectives, and lo and behold, these Indigenous perspectives are French postmodernism from the 1960s. It's like, wow. That seems odd. Something's wrong here. Anyway, so that was basically the path.
Yes. So before we get into discussing it in more detail, these ideas, you have put forward the word woke and wokeism.
Right.
And I think it might be helpful if we explore a little bit what your understanding of that term is, and how you define it, because I know it's a very contentious matter now. And I was reluctant for many years using the word woke, because I saw it as kind of a bit of an insult, when I actually do think it is a descriptive term for a particular phenomenon that we're trying to understand. But you use the term, so to make sure that we're going to be on the same page, how do you define this term?
I don't have a handy definition, but it has certain elements that I'm aware of. So I might define it as something along the lines of authoritarian cultural postmodernism or something. And I think postmodernism is its essence. which, and I'm no philosopher, but I understand that to be essentially an epistemological system that describes reality more subjectively than objectively, and basically says that there's either no such thing as the real world, or there is practically no such thing as the real world, not a real world that we can universally perceive and agree exists and agree what it looks like. Rather, we're all isolated in these little silos where we get a different perspective of the real world depending on which silo we happen to be standing in. And those silos are, of course, defined almost exclusively by the shape and size of your body, which is bizarro. So if you have black skin, if you are missing a leg, if you are short, if you speak certain languages, etc., then you're going to be looking through a particular silo at reality. And others won't. So you're not really going to be able to agree about what reality is. So that's kind of at its base. And then cultural, I say, because it's, I think we're in the midst of a cultural revolution. And it's effectively an attack on our existing culture, which it calls white supremacy or colonialism or ableism or all of the isms. But we fondly call it liberal democracy. And I would say too, and I'm no Christian, but I would say a liberal democracy which is really informed by a Christian moral ethic. And by that I mean things like universal man, universal truth, universal morality, forgiveness, private property, rule of law, all of those kinds of concepts. And then what was the other piece I had on there? Authoritarian. It's and this is probably actually the better definition is James Lindsay's, which is Maoism with American characteristics. Basically, Maoism, you take the 1960s civil rights, 50s, I guess, civil rights movement, you carve out its soul and you put Mao Zedong in it, and that's wokeness now. So, it's Maoism in the sense that, first of all, it's ideology all over everything. It is the paramount interest, and the paramount value is the ideology. In China, I think they used to call it party line. Everything is about party line. And it's authoritarian. Like the cancel culture is an authoritarian means of silencing dissidents, of expunging dissidents from positions of power, of bringing into positions of power ideological conformists. And I think by force rather than through democratic consensual means, reshaping Canada.
Because I'm quite interested, because I am interested in James Lindsay's ideas. I disagree with him on a lot of things, but still I do think he has sort of the basis of understanding this. I don't really know very much about Maoism. I know there was this red book that he had that everyone had to kind of accept as truth and so on, which seems to be quite aligned with the woke kind of position. What I find to be interesting is the postmodernism of the 1960s was, and I think you're correct about the subjectivity of it, like that's sort of the idea is that there's the subjectivity of it, but the strange thing which has happened with wokeism, which I think makes it somewhat different than postmodernism, is that it does seem to say that there is a truth. It's just the truth of these kind of particular and not all of the members of the group either, like a particular perspective that it favors and that everyone should pretend to accept. This seems to be happening, and I'm quite curious about how we went from this subjectivity to this kind of, this is now the sort of little red book kind of idea that you've got to pretend to accept and sort of, make assertions. And anyone who doesn't, says something that's contrary to it, is going to have various, kind of cancellation tactics. So do you have any insights about how we went from a kind of a subjectivity to this kind of dogma that
Mhm.
everyone's got to pretend to accept.
I mean, I don't know organically how it happened. I know that I mean, James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose talk about this transition from just pure subjectivity to, basically, I think what they describe, and I think I've heard you use the term too, reified postmodernism.
Yeah,
Basically, postmodernism, by itself, if you accept the premises of postmodernism, it sort of dissolves into nihilism, because if everything's a perspective, then your belief that there's nothing but a perspective is a perspective, right? So it doesn't, there's, I'd say pure land postmodernism is almost nihilistic. Then I think the sort of evil genius of wokeness, whoever, I mean, I guess we can name some of the thinkers that were responsible for this, like Derek Bell and that sort of
yeah,
chain of thinkers. But I think the evil genius was realizing that, okay, well, this nihilistic, destructive kind of ideology of postmodernism doesn't do anything, because it doesn't believe that anything is real, including it doesn't believe that there's, if nothing's real, then nothing can really be changed, and there's really no point in changing it, because there's no objective good either.
yeah,
And so I as I understand it, they, the genius was to say, okay, well, let's fix some things. Let's decide, let's choose some things as being fixed realities. And
yeah,
I think that two fixed realities are there. One is a truth, which is that basically, postmodernism is correct, and that the primary dividing line between people's different silos is oppression. And so, that really, the way we think, the way we speak, and the way we interact with one another is informed based on what is going to sustain hierarchies of oppression, right? So they fixed that,
mm.
and then they fixed, what, I mean, I think it's totally incoherent. I mean, I think it's nonsense and
Well,
ridiculous, but
they argue that demanding coherence
right,
itself is kind of a symptom of sort of the
whiteness.
progressive enlightenment kind of position. Um, my own view is that the postmodern, what happened with postmodernism is it was just and Alan Sokal, who's a great thinker, who people, if they haven't heard of Alan Sokal, who did the Sokal hoax in the 1990s, where he submitted this parody article, which was accepted by the postmodernists. He describes it as postmodernism removes what he calls the rational warrant. It destroys that. So you have no you no longer can say this is unreasonable what you're saying, because reason itself has been sort of destroyed by postmodernism.
Problematized. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was kind of the background, and then with that in place, now you have a whole bunch of things can now be asserted which would not be accepted otherwise.
Right.
So I think postmodern, like I know Lindsay and Pluckrose use the term reified postmodernism, which I did use myself, and I still do a bit because it sounds more academic than wokeism. But the problem with that term, it seems to me, is that if it's not going to be relativistic anymore, it's not really postmodernism. Like postmodernism was this subjective thing, and now with what they call reified postmodernism, there's a demand, and reified, for people who don't know what that means, it means make real. So you take something which is not real, and then you make it real. So it has the appearance of being real, but it's actually not real. And that's really with these kind of claims that are being made by whatever oppressed group, the demand that you make those real, even if you don't believe them to be true. So, and there's a bunch like the trans activism stuff is a good example of this. So that you have a person who's male, that's their sex, but they think that they are a woman. Now, you could say, well, you're a man who believes he's a woman. That's would be the kind of the scientific way of saying that. But because of this kind of reification process that happens with wokeism, no one can say that. And in fact, you will be punished severely if you say that, because you're denying their understanding of themselves, which in this kind of climate is really what's important, because they're oppressed. And in order for them to be able to overcome their oppression, their subjective view people have to pretend that that is actually an objective position.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm just trying to think these things through myself, because I don't quite know, like, this transition from subjective to the demand that people accept the subjective position of certain individuals or who are tied to groups as objective is kind of what the key quote unquote wokeism kind of strategy is. And it just, I still am having a hard time figuring out how that transition was made.
Yeah, and I think that I'm also trying to piece this all together, but I think the word violence and denying existence relate to that concept.
Yes.
Right. So am I right that and I'm going to call them wokies. See, some people use woke as an insult. I don't use woke as an insult. I use it as a description. But when I say wokey, that's kind of insulting.
Yes, it is. Yes. So we're trying to understand, and I think there are people that I know who are quote unquote woke, who really do legitimately think, like, they're not bad people. They think this is the way to create a better society. It's just
right.
Because of the authoritarian character of this position, you really can't get into the dynamics of their kind of thought process, because there's all sorts of now restrictions on taking this on, and is actually imposed by things like human rights commissions and stuff like that. Like, so things are getting quite serious in terms of the legal kind of side of things. But the violence, this kind of thing. So words are violent, certain words, but certain forms of violence itself, which is usually what we think is violent, is not violence, because
right.
that's helping to overcome oppression. So
right.
Words which are felt to maintain oppression are violence, and actual violence, which is being used to overcome, in terms of perception, is perceived to overcome oppression, is not violence. So this is kind of part of postmodernism too, is the definitions of things. Like the word that you think you're using to describe something is not the definition that they're using. So everyone gets into this very confused state about what we're talking about all the time.
Right. Yeah. And that incoherence is, I think, a useful attribute for the proponents of wokeness. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think that if you start from the premise that really there is no existence, there is no true existence that has any meaning except one's subjective existence. And if you subjectively believe you're a woman, then reality is that you are a woman by those premises. If somebody says you're not a woman, then that person is basically attempting to dismantle your existence. And so that's violence, a personal form of violence. You're doing violence to my reality, because the construct in my mind, which is my reality, if you try to deconstruct that in some way, you are effectively deconstructing everything that is in fact reality. So you might as well be an alien arriving, with a spaceship blasting away or something like that, because you're destroying my reality. So sometimes I think that violence on a personal level is used to mean that. And then first, do you think I'm right about that? Or
I think that is that's what's happening on a number of these cases. I have heard with respect, and that for me, that the area, if you really want to understand wokeism, trans activism is the best area, because it's the most woke of all the woke. It's the most subjective of all. It's the most the underpinnings of it are the most subjective. Biological sex is like one of the most real things that we know in terms of all of this. Like race is not. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Race is a very, very contested concept because of the confusion of skin color with inherited characteristics. So you can have people who have a certain genetic background that over a few generations, when they move to a warm climate, their skin becomes dark. As well, you have migrations and hybridization and all these sorts of things. So race is a term that is not very well substantiated. Like there's arguments about this. I don't. Some people argue that it is a plausible concept. Others, but they're having a debate about it. No one before 15 years ago would contest biological sex as a reality.
Right.
But now it's like it is the thing that is attacked the most. Like that's where you're going to get into the most trouble if you start demanding that people accept the biological reality of sex. So I think trans activism, if people want to understand wokeism, that's the place to go, because it just seems to me to be the most, sort of the demand that the most subjective belief be reified the most and be be accepted throughout, and all these kinds of demands for pronouns and everything like that. And if you refuse to use pronouns which are not linked to biological sex, you're going to be hauled before a human rights commission. Right. Whereas if you refuse to kind of accept this kind of subjectivity of other things, you probably wouldn't encounter such a harsh response.
Right. Yeah.
But I've heard with trans, they say that you are engaged in genocide against trans people. So this is like the destruction of the humanity kind of idea that's used in the context of trans activism.
Right. Well, and I mean, it depends what you mean by genocide, but I think that I would say that the effect of trans activism, especially trans activism in schools, is to probably increase the proportion of our population which considers itself somehow trans. So if you oppose trans activism, I suppose there is a genocide of sorts, because you're probably going to, push society, or you're going to tend to push society back towards a more, clear binary.
Less trans.
Yeah.
Well, I've heard some people argue that there is no such thing as trans. Like this is just a made up thing. Now I don't really know. Like that was kind of the funny thing about trans activism is it's not really my area. So I don't really know. Like I was on this discussion with Kathleen Lowry and Elizabeth Weiss and so on, and we got into the chat talking about all this, and I still don't know if there's any examples of both sexes being in one body. So like the actual determination of biological sex is not chromosomes. It is the gametes. It's done through gametes. So you have large immobile gametes for females, and you have small mobile gametes for males. That's the kind of division, the binary. Is there a case of a person who has both large immobile gametes and small mobile gametes in one body? I still don't know whether that's the case or not, but if there is, it is very few. Like it would be a very, very, just almost an incredibly small percentage. So if we're going to be kind of seeing trans in that way, which is going to be having, there's some kind of combination of the biological sexes, or however we're defining it, not subjectively. Like, I do accept there are, males who think that they're women and females who think that they're men. And
Right.
perhaps there's people who think that they're neither male nor female. But this is all there's like, you can think, you can believe anything that you want. So there's no limit to the subjective kind of characteristics of people.
Right. Yeah. And I was going to say, I mean, where you're sitting here exploring whether or not there's trans based on objective criteria, but you've denied the entire premise, right? The entire premise is there's no such thing as an objective criteria, right?
But that's the weird thing, though, is that they're trying to get you to accept the subjective aspect as objective. Like, there's a move that's being made.
Right.
So it's not just like everyone has their view and we're all just going to be kind of perpetually not able to communicate. That's not what's going on. It is, there's this view, which is the correct view. And if you don't accept that view and pretend that you do, like, you have to pretend, like, I think they don't really care whether you do it. Well, maybe they're trying to train you, right? So you're going to go through some, Maoist, shaming struggle thing, so that you'll have a sign hung around your neck and people will berate you and things like this. And then eventually you'll just want to be a part of society. So you just kind of give up on it. I don't quite know. It's a difficult thing because, but certainly now there's a whole bunch of people going around who do not believe any of this, but they're pretending to believe.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's crucial is the, and I don't know if it's a cult thing or a Maoist thing or an authoritarian thing, but there is something very powerful about a person who can force another one to participate in a lie. And once you start to participate in a lie as a society, you can, I think, very quickly descend into madness or into whatever, structure the person who's forcing you into that lie has in mind for you. But, I think that, you raise a very good point, which is, I mean, it's kind of fascinating, right? Like, and this is its incoherence, is that, okay, a trans person says, okay, my subjective reality is I may have been born with a penis, but I'm a woman inside me. And the incoherence, you want to say, what the heck's a woman then? There's no way to define woman. Why would you feel like a woman if there's no such thing as a woman? What do other people mean when they say woman? The same thing you mean? Like, why use the term woman instead of woman or giba? Like, it doesn't, it's totally incoherent. But anyway, they have their own subjective reality. Okay, fine. They say, okay, it's violence to my reality to question my trans identity or question that there is such a thing as trans or whatever. Okay, fine. But you're right. They then go the next step to say, you have to also deny your subjective reality.
Yeah.
And you have, including your belief that there is such a thing as an objective reality.
Yeah.
So it goes far over the top of, just leave me in my own mind hole alone. It's like, leave me in my own mind hole alone and get out of your own mind hole. Like, you're not allowed to be in your mind, right? So it's interesting. I wanted to just back up for a second and talk about this both, I guess, the gamete thing and the contested issue of race.
Yep.
So I have this theory that one of the I'd say methods of deconstruction that woke uses is to challenge category. Right. And I think what the trick is to say, if there's any nuance to a category, then there's no such thing as the category. So, and the first time I came across this concept was in a book whose author I can't remember, but it was called Through the Looking Glass. And it was it basically, I actually only read half of it, but he had done a study where he'd gone all over the world and he had basically shown a bunch of color swatches to different cultures and people and said, what do you call red? Where do you divide the line between red and purple or red and orange? And then he showed that all of these different cultures in different areas of the world have slightly different definitions of red. Some cultures don't even have a concept of, blue. They just call it gray along with green or, different things like that. So he showed that there were some sort of differences. But one of the things you notice, if you look at that, is that across the world, there's also a lot of similarity. So yeah, the boundaries on what you call red may be fuzzy, but across space and time, we see all different cultures agreeing that there is something different about red as compared to blue, right? So there is some objective reality to that category, whether or not you can clearly define the category or not.
Yeah.
And you see the same. So do we take that and we say, oh, there's no such thing as color? I mean, no. Do we say that the categories of color are meaningless? No, we don't. And so I think
the general color is the general, and then there's the specific element. So I think that all cultures see color, like they make a distinction at some level between whatever it may be, and it's going to obviously be determined by the way they live in the world. So for us, I think, first of all, I think as you have cultural development occurs, you have more and more divisions of color. Like it makes no sense for a hunter gatherer to know the difference between, you know, fuchsia and rose or something, like, unless it's got some kind of linkage to some kind of survival.
You need to have a use for that distinction.
Yes, like, and now we have, if you go to a paint store, right? It's like we have too many, like there's just too many options, because everything is like, you know, like more like, and you actually have, if you look at computer programs, if you're ever trying to do artwork on, you know, you have very small gradations between colors and so on. So as you become more developed culturally, you're going to have more and more fine distinctions. But that's kind of an interesting question as to why some cultures see this as an important distinction, whereas others don't really care about it. Like, and it's going to be linked to something about that. Maybe they have different materials that they're working with, which have that color in them. So when they're painting their bodies and so on, they whatever, like it's going to have some kind of conceptual thing. But the color, they all make some distinctions. Like it's not just like, oh, some people don't see color at all. Like it's just it's a culture that just doesn't.
Yeah. No, I guess maybe I phrased that wrong. My point is that all cultures have just about the same idea for red, and just about the same idea for blue, and just about the same idea for brown, you know, so that there is something objectively, that there is something that we can objectively agree to there. There's some truth to the category of red, even though, you know, and my point is, even where you have a spectrum, like a perfect spectrum, it is a perfect spectrum, right? When you change, you know, the wavelength of light by one, whatever the heck the wavelength is measured by, you've changed the color a little bit, right? And you change it again, and it's just a progressive, sort of infinitely perfect spectrum. And even there, humans can find meaningful groups of, categories, right? And so my point is that, okay, so now we pick something much easier, like sex, right? And you see trans activists looking around the world for some example of, oh, well, there's some people that are born with no genitals, or some people born with two genitals. Ipso facto, there's no such thing as man and woman. It's like, no, there's still very meaningful categories called man and woman.
And just on the color example, it would be interesting to see whether all cultures have an understanding of primary colors. So blue, yellow, and red are the primary colors, which are the basis of all the other colors. Like, do all cultures see those primary colors as being existing and distinct from one another? In terms of that's another kind of thing that happens with postmodernism, is that the exception, so the unusual thing is taken as the thing to focus on, as opposed to, like, I don't know, and I never did, I was told in this, I don't know, I'm not an expert in these matters, but there really is not an example of a person who has both large immobile gametes and small mobile gametes. That doesn't exist. What you have is abnormalities, if we can use the term, which is a no-no, on both the female side and the male side. So it's not like there's a spectrum. It's like you've got male and female, and then you've got abnormalities on the female and the male. That's the trans, quote unquote, trans thing. I've been told. I don't know this because I'm not an expert, but I'm just absorbing rational discussions, because it doesn't really make sense to say that sex is a spectrum, because we have reproduced ourselves due to the binaric opposition. And if you get rid of the binaric opposition, you do away with human existence, because it means that you won't be able to have the two types of gametes coming together to form the person. So it just makes sense that that's the case. But the problem is with wokeism, the kind of conversation we're having right now, if it isn't already, is soon going to be illegal. Like, it certainly will get you into trouble, like, for sure. Like, people just see it as being not something that is going to be a career enhancer.
You have professionals in Canada that are being fired for having conversations like this, or being punished by the regulators for having conversations.
Like the Human Rights Commission, and but anyway, that's another matter. So this is all very interesting, but because you're a lawyer and you're involved in these legal battles,
right?
It might be helpful for us to talk a little bit about the law and what does it mean. So wokeism, we still haven't kind of hammered that down very well, but we do accept that this kind of subjectivity is part of it, and also the demand that the subjective beliefs of some individuals be accepted as objective. How does this translate into woke, the legal system becoming woke?
How does that translate into the legal system becoming woke?
So how does a woke legal system differ from a non-woke legal system?
Well, I mean, I think the primary in every conceivable way. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to overstate how different it is, but I mean, okay, well, I mean, we just talked about the woke attack on category, right? That we need to deconstruct categories, because categories are problematic, and categories are ways to oppress people, and categories are a manifestation of objectivism and empiricism, and that's a problem, and all kind of stuff. The law operates entirely on categories, right? It draws categories between people who did commit a crime and didn't commit a crime, and the people who didn't commit a crime don't go to jail, and the ones who did go to jail. So if you remove the concept of category, I don't know how the law operates. And that's that's kind of nothing compared to the main problem, I think, which is the law. I mean, the law. Okay, well.
So what? Just to kind of go into that a bit there. What would be an example of wokeism doing away with the category in law? Like, what are some cases where this is?
Well, I mean, and that's honestly, that's not that whole, the idea that wokeness likes to destroy categories is something that I kind of peripherally know, and it's I'm aware of it. I don't totally understand its ramifications, so I don't totally understand how it would operate in the law, because I don't know much about it.
But I mean, think about it like from the path of perspective, like the indigenous area. So in wokeism, there's sort of an understanding that indigenous people are never really guilty. So we in the law, we have guilty and not guilty.
Right.
But if we're going to destroy the category of guilt because of oppression, so those who are oppressed are never guilty.
Right.
Whereas those who are oppressors are always guilty.
Right.
So we can see this at work a bit, and I know this is just throughout the whole indigenous kind of file, is that we just bend over backwards constantly to not find indigenous people guilty, or at least kind of rub off the harsh edges of what it means to be guilty.
Right. And I think that maybe that like I don't doubt that categorization is one way to look at that, but I think that the more simple way to look at that is that so in law, the Supreme Court has said that it has embraced the concept of systemic discrimination and colonialism, which means that you have oppressive systems that cause some people to be rich and privileged and happy and powerful, and causes other people to be poor and underprivileged and unhealthy and miserable. And that's, you can call that systemic discrimination, you can call it whiteness, white supremacy, colonialism. They're all kind of the same concept, just with different branding based on what church of woke, or which church of woke you're attending. But the court has embraced this concept, and in particular they've applied it to Indigenous sentencing. So the basic premise is we look at the justice system and we say, there are, maybe 6 to 8 times as many Indigenous men in prison than other Canadians that are in prison, or rather proportionately 6 times or 8 times as many. And therefore, there is something wrong with our justice system. It's called systemic discrimination. So systemic discrimination just says, basically it's kind of a trick. You just look at a system and you look at the outcome of the system, and if there's a disproportionate negative impact on a minority of some sort, then you impugn the entire integrity of the justice system or the system that you're looking at, and you say it has to be fixed, right? So which is, first of all, is there any hard math done to determine whether or not that's actually the cause of these things? I don't think so. No, they basically just look at the system, and if the result is a disproportionate impact, then the system is deemed to be the problem, without anybody doing the math to figure out whether or not that's the case. Meaning nobody sits down and analyzes 150 cases to show that, in each one of those 150 cases, or in a majority of them, there were significant instances of discrimination along the way that caused the person to get an unfair trial, suggested that they had been, whatever, they were given a much harsher sentence, whatever. There's none of those. Maybe there is some out there, but there's, so far as I know,
there are some, but they're not done by there was some great stuff done probably 20 years ago by a woman by the name of Carol LaPrairie, who does great material on the Indigenous legal system. And in her analysis, it was actually Indigenous people were treated more leniently in the system. It's just that you had far greater numbers of Indigenous people, well, largely men, of course, but also probably women, basically committing more crimes. So, if you're going to commit more crimes, then it's likely that, it's going to be the case if you have the justice system is acting in a non-woke way, which is basically treating the offense as the issue. So you focus on the offense, not on the person. If you focus on the person, then you've got to look at their background and see all the various reasons why they could have committed the crimes that they did. And then based upon that kind of a woke kind of analysis, that's when you're going to try and skew things so that you don't have as many people being sentenced for as long or being convicted or whatever's going to happen. But in terms of her analysis of the offense, which is kind of key, if you're going to have a non-woke approach, because it used to be that we were concerned that people who committed the same offense would have very, very different kind of sentencing. So the idea was that you weren't supposed to have, if you both murdered someone and under the same condition, you both, whatever it may be, the nature of the actual offense itself, then you would expect that you would have the same amount of jail time or whatever that would be meted out. That was kind of the previous system.
Yeah, I think there's always been an aspect though of looking at the offender's background to because if the offender is a daddy's rich boy that just decided that he was going to murder some chick for fun, and versus a person who had a really bad life and had mental health issues and was on all sorts of antipsychotic medication, the court's going to go, well, that person is less morally blameworthy than the other guy. But importantly, you dealt with each individual that came before you as an individual with the same equal rights under law, including the equal right to have the judge look at your background and determine whether or not that showed moral culpability, etc. So that was certainly key.
But that would be, I would imagine, would be in terms of your ability to know whether what you were doing was wrong, right? So
yeah,
if you could have like a rich person who had psychotic episodes,
yeah,
and a poor person who was totally like understanding what they were doing, and that would be treated, that you wouldn't say, oh well, because they're a rich person, they, although they are psychotic, have these psychotic episodes, the fact that they grew up in a rich home meant that they shouldn't really have developed that, therefore, like all these kinds of explanations that would be given, as well. I was just thinking in terms of this, like the intent. So that's a big part. That's an interesting part of the law too, is that there's intent and then there's consequence. So people run through stop signs every day accidentally, and nothing happens.
Right.
If a policeman saw them running through a stop sign, they would be given whatever penalty for that. However, if they ran a stop sign and accidentally hit another car and killed everyone in that car, that would be now seen differently, because the effect of your crime had this. And that's kind of an interesting balancing that goes on, because there's really no difference in intent between someone who runs through a stop sign accidentally and has no effect, and someone who runs through a stop sign accidentally and kills a bunch of people accidentally, right? And even within a car, if no one had died within the car versus a whole bunch of people died. Like, I was just thinking of that school bus accident where this guy was driving a truck and he just went through a stop sign, and then it was just this horrible, tragic consequence. And it was kind of like, hey, but he killed 20 people here, so we gotta, when what he did was not really, there's done in another context. So there's that kind of balancing that goes on as well in the law.
Yeah. Well, and there's also, I mean, not that it's all that important, but there's also, what is the public focusing on? So, I drive around all the time infuriated, as many people do, because people don't pay attention to driving. They don't have two hands on the wheel. They don't keep their center of their lane. They change lanes without signaling. They're just sloppy, terrible drivers. But the ones that we hear about that are really the criminals, and the ones that everyone seems to hate most, are the ones that drive quickly. And I'm not saying that speed doesn't kill. It certainly does. But I also say that running into things also kills. And you see a lot of people that can't control their vehicle, but I don't think that there's the same societal emphasis on resolving some causes of car accidents which kill people as there is an emphasis on other causes. And speed is the one that everyone's really focused on, and drunk driving, but other ones, just a pure inability to drive competently, is rarely talked about as a major problem, even though it is one.
So I just don't want to, we're going to run out of time soon for your segment. So I wanted to get to, you wrote an interesting piece in the Western Standard on the Supreme Court, what's happening with the Supreme Court. And which is, I think everyone should be, of all the legal issues that are going on right now, we should be the most concerned about the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is the highest court of appeal, which kind of makes decisions which then percolate downwards through the system. So what's your view on what's happening with the Supreme Court recently?
Well, I think the Supreme Court is getting more and more progressive, and I'm going to use the term progressive to try to keep myself out of trouble. But and I can use that term because that's how the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court described it. He was asked a couple of years ago whether or not he agrees with the statement that the Supreme Court of Canada is the most progressive in the world, and he, quote, proudly agreed. so he calls it progressive. I think if you look at the court's rulings, I see wokeness in that progressivism.
Okay.
Whether or not, I to circle back to something that you said earlier, I think a lot of people who say woke things or promote woke ideas may not even understand the full majesty of wokeness, much less buy into the whole thing. But you certainly see some of it coming out of the Supreme Court. And again, to go back to, native sentencing, that's a big one.
Yeah.
The decisions Gladue and Ipili are good examples of that, where the court basically says, things like the reason there's so many Indigenous people in prison is because they don't even have the same ideas about substantive justice as we do, which is a fascinating. I think if you said that 50 years ago, you'd be pilloried as a racist. But nowadays that's seen as progressive to characterize Indigenous people as fundamentally different. And in fact, to go back to the path that lawyers were required to attend in Alberta, that was a major point, was that Indigenous people think very differently than other Canadians. The suggestion seemed to be that they don't have the same sort of linear, rational, objective, scientific approach towards reality. Instead, they have more of a sort of intuitive, maybe myth-based, naturalistic, circular, I don't know, kind of way of looking at the world. So that's, there's this trend in the court, and I think the recent appointment of Justice Moreau makes that problem worse. She replaces Russell Brown. Russell Brown left under a bit of a scandalous cloud in the last, I think, maybe 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And he was a very rule of law oriented justice. So I think it's a great loss. It was a loss for him to be off the bench, and I don't think he was substituted with somebody of his same rule of law interests. So yeah, what I get into in that article is just a kind of sliver of the problem. So you and I talked about how an offender comes before the court, and one of the things the judge does when they sentence that person is think about that person's background. And including things like, you had a traumatized childhood, you were beaten, you're whatever, all those kinds of things, things that I think you're right, suggest that there's less moral culpability and therefore sentencing should be reduced. So that context, what the court now gets into, both in that area of the law and in other areas of the law, is context, social context. And social context can mean either looking objectively at the world based on what rigorous science tells us, or it can mean looking at the world with your progressive goggles on, and seeing the world as systems of oppression and mutual incompatibility of culture and language, all that kind of stuff. And I think that more and more the court is taking a progressive or kind of a woke worldview as the social context upon which they should be handing down, very I would say powerful judgments, powerful in the sense that they change the way Canada looks.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting what you said about, like, we always have considered the background of people in the legal system or in the justice system, but now things are a bit different, like it's being done a bit differently.
Right.
So I'm just curious, like, how is this difference manifesting itself?
Okay, so the examples I provide in that case are Gladue and Ipili, and those are the Supreme Court cases where the court is, I think it's fair to say, trying to reduce what they see as a problem. I mean, it's a problem, but trying to reduce Indigenous incarceration. So it's a decarceration effort.
Yeah.
Which, to go back to incoherence again, we had a missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls inquiry that looked into the problem of there being so many Indigenous women and girls who were murdered and abused and kidnapped, etc. And one of the things that inquiry assiduously avoided, although I noted in the report they got into it a bit, was domestic violence. And then there was a Statistic Canada report released about 2 months ago, which mirrors another report that I found from about 2016, which shows that violence against Indigenous women is done primarily by, if not domestic partners, then by people that are familiar to them, meaning probably members of their community, meaning probably other Indigenous people. Which is, that's normal. We if we live in a community of people, we experience crime, we're likely, the victims of crime in that community. There's nothing, unusual about that. But the point being, if you see too many men in prison as being a problem, and therefore you want to get men out of prison, and men who commit crimes that otherwise would have them in prison are now released into the community, it seems to me you're going to seriously aggravate the problem for which that inquiry was established. Because you're going to be, I think the statistics would suggest, you're going to be taking Indigenous offenders who have committed crimes on people, including women and girls, and you're going to release them into the community. Now they would say you're going to release them after having done some sort of a conciliatory effort that has kind of cured them of the problem. But I worry that that's going to increase the risk to the community. Sorry, you're going to say?
Just to try to understand the wokeism kind of dynamic a little bit more, how do you think that someone who's quote unquote woke would respond to that? Like would they just avoid that? Because
they'd call it a myth and a stereotype.
They would just say that people who are making those arguments are racist or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what the commissioner, I can't remember her name, of that inquiry, the missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls inquiry. I found a newspaper article one time, which I can no longer find, where she was asked, why aren't you looking at domestic violence? And she said, oh, that's a stereotype. I'm not going to entertain your stereotypes. Even though the statistics were clear that is a major, like the biggest problem, she still called that a stereotype. So they just ignore it.
As well, the focus became serial killers at some point.
Yeah.
Which is a very minor, like, not to say this is not a terrible thing that goes on, but if we're looking at why so many Indigenous people are being killed, or Indigenous women especially are being killed, certainly there's going to probably be a higher proportion are going to be killed by serial killers than non-Indigenous because of the prostitution aspect and so on, and perhaps the racist person who wants to go and kill a bunch of Indigenous women, that's possible as well. But that's going to be like focusing on, you don't have very many Indigenous men who are serial killers. It's a kind of a unique thing. Whereas if we just looked at murders more generally, then you would have people being beaten to death and all this kind of stuff, which is this kind of violence, like that's what it's going on in these communities, which is kind of the frightening thing, is that these communities have a much higher rate of violence against men, against women, against children, etc. Like this is a much higher level. So women are going to be this is going to be a major problem in terms of women being killed in that context. But I think there's a way of kind of diverting attention onto some things and avoiding attention onto others, which is a way of kind of making it so that the nature of the problem, which really is, why are Indigenous communities so violent? Like, why is there so much violence in these communities? And that is a very, complex sociological question, which there would be quite a lot of disagreement about. But we're not even really talking about that, because really the whole thing is about kind of shifting the lens to kind of look at sort of it's non-Indigenous people who are the problem. It's not the Indigenous community, which has, and I'm not saying that we should be blaming people here for anything, but it's just, in order to solve a problem, you got to understand the cause. And we're so distracted looking at a whole bunch of other things which really don't have anything to do with what it is that we're trying to understand.
Right.
Anyway, Glenn, I think we can continue this this discussion, but I should just leave things up to you now, because I think we're at about an hour or something.
Okay. Yeah,
I'm not
we're
sure.
about that. Sure.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, can I finish off the thoughts?
Yes,
I got two thoughts I want to finish off here. One
okay.
is the shifting of the focus thing.
Yep.
Which is, yeah, I think one of the attributes of wokeness is that it likes to focus on some things and not others. And what it likes to focus on is systems, right? It likes to focus on the system, and it likes to focus on, it doesn't like to focus on individual accountability, right? Because individual account, like, and I think this is one of the ways that wokeness really contradicts with the Christian worldview, where the Christian worldview is that you are an individual with agency. And, to use the Christian concept, you alone can find Jesus, or whatever they would say. You have the agency to kind of determine your fate. Whereas wokeness really treats people as completely lacking agency, which is, on the one hand, I think a lot of, I want to say, well, just general Canadians, the reason that woke is so one of the reasons it's so powerful is it feels nice to not blame people for things, right? It feels nice to say, oh, you're in prison, but it wasn't really your fault, or, oh, well, you killed someone, but you didn't really control that. Like, there's this kind of impulse to sort of excuse and whatever, and that's all nice and stuff like that. But I see that as being really a real curse, because if you tell a population of people that you have no agency, they may come to believe it. Right, which is a just moral degradation. So that worries me. But the systems they like to they like to focus on systems, right? And the systems they like to focus on, again, are basically liberal democracy, right? And by liberal democracy, I mean things like, parliamentary sovereignty, freedom of conscience, rule of law, all of these different kind of concepts. They like to always focus their attack on that somehow. And by focusing your attack even on white offenders rather than on the most statistically prevalent offender, which I think when it comes to domestic violence, well, I know when it comes to domestic violence against Indigenous women and girls, it's other Indigenous people. Instead of focusing on that, they like to focus on white people, because white is a proxy for liberal democracy, right? It's a proxy for that system. And so I think that's really an important point, and I'm curious if you agree that if you really had to define what is the point of wokeness, it's to dismantle liberal democracy. Am I wrong?
I think I would agree partially, because I think it's authoritarian. So, like, liberal democracy, for all its, and there's things wound up with that, which are contested, but one of the things about it is the kind of protections against arbitrary use of power. Like that. That's one of the things that liberal democracy tries to do. It's got, difficulties in terms of the economic system and so on that can be talked about, but in terms of its the legal kind of framework is through, hundreds of years of common law and the aristocrats using power arbitrarily. We put in place mechanisms to try to protect against that, which is a bit of a bulwark against
the rule of law.
And wokeism is intent on destroying that, right? Because it claims that it kind of confuses a little bit capitalist economic circumstances with legal protection. So it's saying things like the wealthy, it's kind of the Anatole France quote of, both the rich and the poor are equal under the law. Both cannot sleep under bridges, and and steal bread. Like that's the point he was trying to get at with that comment, is that the legal system, although it's quote unquote fair, it's not, because of the economic differences. You still have these injustices that happen. Like that's kind of, and that has to be kind of disentangled, all these things. But the woke are not really interested in having, these kind of looking at economic versus legal kinds of intersections of things. They just say all these identity categories are on this kind of sort of hierarchy of oppression, and therefore the legal system should just subvert things so that, if you're a woman, you can just accuse men of things and they don't have any protections because women are, by their identity, are, disadvantaged and so on. So I think that's what wokeism does, is it attacks the protections against arbitrariness in its pursuit of subverting the system. And what we're going to see, I believe, is, because people are more likely to accept that when the argument's being made to pursue social justice through this mechanism. Once the system is destroyed, that's when you're going to see the real kind of face of this, which is going to be, basically fascism starting to assert itself. And so, like, they're going to use, like, I think the woke for this kind of fascistic element are kind of useful idiots who are sort of doing, like, they're the first wave that is kind of getting people to go along with these destructions of due process, because people think it's going to be helpful, like, which it's not, because, as you just pointed out with the Indigenous case, letting a whole bunch of violent Indigenous men back into the communities is not that's going to make things worse in those
You'd think, wouldn't you?
But because people think that's helping, and like they're going, okay, well, what's the harm? Like, it'll Indigenous people are oppressed, they're being incarcerated because of this kind of racism and everything. What's the harm of just kind of reducing the sentences of all the people who have been treated in this kind of oppressive way, this kind of thing? Like, I think it's intermingled. Wokeism is intermingled with a much more sinister kind of movement, which is going to, once we destroy the protections, is going to be able to assert itself much more forcefully.
Okay, let's go back to that in a second. I think of wokeness as being utopian. Do you agree?
I don't know. I don't. I think it's trying to reverse the existing hierarchy, as how I see it. So it has a particular conception of what the hierarchy is, and it works to subvert that. And I don't think that's really a utopia in any sense of the word. So I guess I would have to see evidence of how it's doing that, because, like, the best example of wokeism that I saw in operation was the Evergreen State College case in Washington, where this is the Brett Weinstein case.
Yep.
It's the best case to look at if you want to see what wokeism does.
Yeah.
Anyway, bunch of these black trans students, because they're doubly oppressed because of their blackness and their transness, managed to kind of impose themselves on the whole system. And wherever you go to a meeting at Evergreen, you'd have these black trans students telling people, this food is for black people. White people can't have this food. So, and they were always seeing things in this way, about how if you were of this particular identity, you should now be in power and everyone else should just stand back and let them assert itself. What it resulted in, of course, because it destroyed the whole foundations of the institution, is just basically a completely, like, people walking around with baseball bats threatening everyone all the time. Like that was the end game of that. And it was, it was based upon we were oppressed. Now it's time for us to oppress you. Like that was kind of the woke kind of view.
Right. So, and on that word again, violence. Do you think that, I mean, one of the things I worry about, and this goes back to, I think one of the things that got you in hot water, well, I know it did, which was you saying when we use terms like genocide, we should probably use those carefully. Which is ironically something that the prime minister said after he called Canada genocidal, and then he was asked whether or not 1.5 million Uyghurs in concentration camps with rapists living in their homes was genocide, and he said, well, we got to be careful when we use these terms. But my thought is that one of the risks of using these words is that we pollute their meaning. And, if you keep saying fire or you keep saying the sky is falling, we have little parables that tell us that's a bad idea, because then when there is a fire or the sky is falling, people don't know it, right? Yeah. And if we keep saying genocide, blah, blah, blah. Do you think that the use of the word violence is, first of all, does it tend to excuse violence because there's allegations that there's violence everywhere? So what's a little more violence?
Yeah, so it seems, and I was kind of alluding to this earlier, that we're like it's almost backwards, like you say that a person who's a man who thinks is a woman saying that, no, you're a man, that's violence, because it destroys your sense of self and makes it so that you are going to have this terrible oppression that is going to be part of your life for the rest of your life, kind of thing. So it's kind of like the effect of it, the perceived effect of it is seen as being the kind of the overarching thing to be concerned about, as opposed to the dictionary definition of violence, which is physical harm or threat of physical harm. But you punch a fascist in the face, you are, by the dictionary definition, imparting violence against them. But in the woke view, you're not, because you've now, you've put that fascist in their place, and the world is a better place, and is actually a less violent world because of the like that's kind of the way in which it's seen, is that it's really not the actual meaning of the word, it's how the word is being understood in terms of a wider context.
Right. Same as the term racism, which doesn't apply to white people because white people have power.
Yeah, it's got all these strange justification exercises that go on according to a preconceived sort of understanding of how things should be, right? So you kind of you change the definitions, you do all these things to better able you to realize what kind of society that you think it should be, and it's always got this kind of instrumentalist type of thing, rather than trying to improve clarity of thought so we can try and figure out what we're talking about. It's really about obscuring our understanding so that then this result can be argued for more easily. And because the result is a better result, this is the argument, we should all just go along with this kind of intellectual muddiness, because that's going to be able to move us into that direction more quickly. But what people don't realize is that if we have muddied thoughts, we could be being led in a direction which is not going to be have a benefit for society. So it's kind of an authoritarian kind of maneuver that we're sort of being convinced to go along, because we're being told this will be better for everyone if we did this. And if you don't go along with it, you're this terrible oppressive person who obviously hates this and that group, and there's all these kind of sort of subtle
sticks and carrots kind
of incentives to go along with these things, when really people have got to start, like, it's in no one's interest for us not to understand what we're talking about, like that is going to
help, no one's
help sort of people who have ill intent,
right,
society.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about that. What ill intent? Who are we talking about? Like, what I just think, if you look at wokeness, you can describe it by its own terms and stuff, but it's what's the point of it and who's driving it? That sounds conspiratorial, but it doesn't. I guess my point is, it doesn't quite explain itself.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, it's kind of people following their interests. So there's people who have an interest in this. So people naturally follow their interests because and they don't tend to see, they don't tend to challenge things which are in their own interests.
Right.
And so we have a couple of dynamics going on, and this is something I'm working through myself. So I haven't completely clarified my thoughts. I'm interested in talking to people like yourself and James Lindsay and Alan Sokol and all these people who are grappling with this, trying to figure out, because it's not an easy thing to try to figure out, first of all, because it's so inconsistent. And secondly, because it's been building up over quite a long time without us really knowing it. Now, here we are at the final kind of stages, trying to figure out everything that's been happening for the last 30 years. But there's definitely a couple of strands that are very important, especially in the university system, which is where I know I am the most aware of what's going on with respect to wokeism in the university system. And there's a couple of elements which are very important, and it's generally opportunism that is driving it. So people are benefiting from it, first of all, because of a destruction of the merit principle. So that's a big part of it. So because of postmodernism saying there's no truth and there's no standards, and any attempts to bring in standards as some kind of white supremacist thing,
right?
The consequence of that has been to throw out the kind of the evaluation, our process of evaluation. And what this did was allowed a lot of people who don't have a high quality of work to get entrenched within these systems.
Right.
And then we have what's called the professional managerial. This is an important part of wokeism. It's called the professional managerial class and the growth of that. So there's been a tremendous growth of these managers and professionals in late capitalism that are not like Bill Gates, who own Microsoft and so on. Like, they don't own things, but they are managing the system and trying to, kind of steer the system to continue when there's all sorts of problems that are going on. And they love wokeism because wokeism allows the arbitrariness to be greater. So these people all benefit financially from the system. And so in the universities, you can see this very, it would be interesting to look at, the corporations and the legal profession and all these things, which is got that going on as well. But that's kind of the drivers. There's this kind of this large burgeoning element within late capitalism that is trying to keep the system going. And they're doing that through this kind of, through the use of wokeism, making people think that what's happening is actually beneficial when it's not beneficial at all. In fact, it's destroying the system.
Right. So
that they won't react against it. It's like anesthetizing us. There's a great thinker who's on my face. I've just had in my spare time, I have all these arguments going on my Facebook page from very interesting people. Anyway, his name's Christopher Nagel, and he's got a great book which is very dense because he's verbose in his argumentation. It's called The Secular Fundamentalist. Anyway, Christopher calls this the jewel wasp of indulgence capitalism, which is kind of the particular stage of capitalism when the jewel wasp is a parasitic wasp that lobotomizes cockroaches, which it preys off of. Anyway, wokeism and all these other kinds of intellectually muddying things is the jewel wasp inserting this venom into our brains, so we're kind of anesthetized. We don't really sense the danger of what's happening. In fact, we often welcome it. saying, oh, we're kind and we're nice, we're helping and so on. It's like, no, this is destroying us. Like we have to realize this, that this is not going to be helpful, and we have to kind of see the world as it is, not the way we want it to be, to properly navigate how we're going to change things. And we really can't do it anymore. And people are so afraid of putting their foot wrong. So everyone's just kind of tippy-toeing around, and I think the trans issue is probably the best example of this. Is that, we have serious damage that is being done as we speak. And in the meantime, we have school boards holding, I can't remember what they're called, but they're for quite young children.
Yeah, what are those things called?
They're
I know what you mean.
You have these meetings, and they're young children. They're like, I don't know.
Drag Queen Story Hour? Is that what we're talking
There's that, but there's
about?
brown bag things where young people who are pre-puberty, or not even, like, they're going to listen to people affirm their identities as trans and so on. And this is happening all over the place when children are becoming more and more confused about things, and this is going to get them on a treadmill, which is going to result in body parts being chopped off and puberty blockers and all these kinds of things. And yet we can't do anything about it because we're afraid that saying something will have this effect. And even in places where you would expect this not to occur, it's happening because everyone's being kind of conditioned to be open and accepting and inclusive and so on. I'm not sure if you heard about this GenSpect. I was just reading about this last week, and I was going, whoa. So they have this conference where they invite all these people who are concerned about children being medicalized with respect to trans. And they have a wide variety of different people there. They've got lawyers, they've got counselors, they've got all these sorts of things. And anyway, so in the midst of it is this, what's called an autogynephile, who gets off on, thinking of himself as a woman. And he's dressed up in this ridiculous dress, and is getting off on all these people, kind of, he wants attention. He's a narcissist. He's all these sorts of things. And people just don't know what to do about it. It's like, let it be. You want to police how people dress. You want to do this.
Right.
He's dressed up in this kind of ridiculous ball gowny kind of thing. Basically, he's not dressed as someone who wants to pass as a woman.
Right. He's
doing this thing, just drawing attention to himself. And of course, we can't do in this current jewel waspy kind of environment. We have no way of combating that because we've sort of been, hey, people want to wear what they want, and like people want to do what they want. And how are we going to stop that? This kind of thing is constantly going on now, and we have no kind of framework to be able to understand things because it's all been destroyed by postmodernism in the 1960s.
Right. Okay.
Oh, sorry, that was a rambling answer.
No, it was good. It was good. So I want to get back to Indigenous issues a bit, and what I was hoping to do is take you a bit through a couple items in the path to get your thoughts on it. But I wanted to first kind of warm up to it.
Yeah.
So your primary thesis in your Indigenous work and in the books you've written is that economic and social progress of Indigenous people is being suppressed by policies that tend to prolong and exacerbate Indigenous isolation and dependency, and by this superstructure of lawyers, advisors, and consultants that I think profit off this problem. So let me ask you this. What are the primary policies that isolate Indigenous people?
There's a number of them. They can sort of be seen in economic, political, and cultural kinds of categories. The economic ones are, isolated, promoting the idea that, a group of, 500 people living in a completely isolated area without any roads and so on. Somehow it's a nation just like Quebec is, that kind of idea with its own and if you just put enough money into that area, it will become a self-sustaining, vibrant kind of place, which is never going to happen.
Froze. I don't know if I froze too.
Sorry, are you still there? I can see you.
You're still frozen.
Am I? I can hear you still. So hopefully it's going to work its way out. You are frozen and I am moving in my screen.